Hi, everybody. I'm Dory Griffin. I teach graphic design and design history at the University of Florida, and I am facilitating as we talk about teaching and learning design through digital archives. We're going to be joined by all of the great folks you see listed on the screen. They'll introduce themselves and contextualize their own individual stories about archives, um, digital experiences, and design praxis. I want to contextualize just very briefly a couple of projects that I've worked on with students in terms of archival research and design practice. So Megan and Samira and Alberto and Alejandra are going to talk to you individually about their research and their own practice. But I would like to put these projects into kind of a larger context just really quickly. The first project that we'll talk about is the visual timeline of typographic printing history. And then the second is a project that I worked on with my design history students last year, looking at recuperative parallel narratives of design history. So project one, the visual timeline, is actually a small part of a much larger project that I've been working on for several years now. I'm working on a visual history of the type specimen as a professional practice and also as a visual form. And one of the things that I proposed with this book was a visual timeline to kind of highlight some of the familiar moments in printing history and contextualize them in a way that would be accessible to designers and design students. So we're familiar with seeing timelines that look a little bit like this, that call to our attention these important moments in a very linear narrative of history. And one of the things that Megan will talk to you about in just a moment is her experience as a design research fellow as a student in the MFA program at Ohio University. And as a research fellow, she worked with me independently over the course of an entire semester to do a great deal of research, finding and preparing images like the ones that you're seeing on the screen that can contextualize printing history in a way that's visual. My larger project, though, asks questions beyond what are the familiar moments in printing history. How do we contextualize the type specimen, which is a project that most graphic design students encounter at some point in their career, but it's not necessarily a subject area that as teachers, there are a lot of really reliable and accessible resources if we want to contextualize this work for our students historically. So my larger project has been to kind of tell the more familiar, at least to printing historians, narrative of how type specimens have functioned for designers and for audiences, but also to ask questions about that timeline. For instance, what were the challenges of developing metal foundry type for Arabic or for Japanese? We're looking here at examples from the American Mission Press in Beirut, printed in 1887 and 1896. And looking at a page from the Katsuji Monyo Mihon, printed in Tokyo in 1885, one of the first type specimens in a Western sense, printed in Japan. Both of these are bilingual texts. Both have complex histories that we don't really have time to get into at the moment. And all of the images, of course, have a really long backstory in terms of locating them and preparing to share them in the context of a published book. A few more really exciting examples. Probably we're all relatively familiar with linotype. It's something that we introduce to our students, but how much do we talk to them about how linotype was advertised or used in, for instance, Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America? This ad from 1898 gives us a window into that context. How much do we know about Hari Govind, who in 1933 patented a linotype matrix for the Hindi language and alphabet? How much do we know about the Syriac press that was operating out of New York in 1912, publishing both historical texts and also a great number of contemporary texts for audiences, primarily who had immigrated fairly recently to the United States, but also for scholarly communities. All of these specimens have been really exciting to track down. Last but not least, maybe we introduce our students to phototype. There are lots of amazing opportunities that probably a lot of us are already taking advantage of to think about how newer technologies have made it in some ways a lot easier to open up the typographic landscape, to welcome into the typographic narrative designers who had been excluded before. Women designers, quote, non-Western alphabets or scripts. Phototype was a really important first step toward the digital turn, and that in turn has opened up so many routes of access that it's really important to see and to document visually. So for every one of these images, and this is where Megan comes in, it's important to know what needs to be seen. Can we find that image? If we can find that image, is there source information included with it as it has been cataloged? Do we know who made it and when and where? Is the image in the public domain? If the answer to that question is yes, is the image then available online for free in high resolution? Often the answer is no. And then finally, will it print in black ink only, just as a technical concern? So every image has a story. Megan's really modest and she'll probably make it sound like it's no big deal that she's uncovered lots and lots and lots of stories for dozens of timeline images. But when you think about how each of these images has its story and its process, it's a really vast undertaking, and Megan's research has been really essential to this project and to developing it into the book that it's going to be, hopefully at some point in its future. If I ever finish it, I hope you will have a chance to read it. You'll get to see, among other things, more images from, for instance, this 1927 Hebrew monotype press specimen printed in New York. The second project that several students are going to talk to you about is this Parallel Histories project. So last year I taught the Survey of Graphic Design History for upper division undergrads and for grad students as well. And we started this semester by looking at this image, which is kind of the traditional timeline of canonical graphic design history, starting with manuscript culture and moving through first to high modernism, corporate modernism, and then to postmodernism. And it's a linear story, right? We read it from beginning to end. There are these famous moments along the way. They're all roughly as important as one another. All of these famous moments were designed for us by men in Western Europe or eventually in North America. But what if this isn't the only story, right? What if history is a web or a network instead of a straight line? And what if, even further, some of these really important moments are still important, but perhaps not quite as important as we always thought they were? So what if Paul Rand's corporate modernist logotypes are lovely and important and wonderful, but perhaps less important than something that we probably know a lot less about? So the GG printed in Korea in 1377, the first dated book that we know of that was printed with movable metal type. Like the Gutenberg Bible, it's a religious text, but there the stories diverge quite dramatically. So what I asked students to do was to think about a subject that they wanted to know more about. It could be something that they were personally connected to, or it could be something that they were interested in finding out about. And this kind of visual graphic here shows you just a few of the things that students were interested in researching, primarily through digital archives. So we're in Gainesville, Florida, where we have an amazing university library, but it's not the same as being in a major metro area like London or Paris or New York. So we have, by necessity, relied on digital archives in many, but not all instances. So in just a moment, you'll hear from these three designers who will talk to you about their research process. So I will not steal their stories. But I do want to mention some of the other projects that took place throughout the semester in this class. So as we went along, students would locate and write about an image every week. And their job was to find an image that was related to my theme for the week, which was probably something broad like manuscript culture or letterpress printing, or possibly advertising design or early modernism. And then they would find a way that that topic was or was not related to the topic that they were particularly interested in. They would locate the image, they would label it with its contextual information, and then they would write a narrative caption, putting that image into context. So a student interested in African American design, for instance, spent a while looking particularly at editorial design. She's an African American designer, often feels very written out of the narratives of design history for reasons that are very clear. She has been written out, but she did a really powerful project and wrote herself and her community into the narrative in amazing ways. Similarly, a designer with Korean heritage was interested in learning more about Korean design because she didn't know much about it. Several women were interested in learning more about design for and about and by women. A couple of folks wanted to focus on political protest. And one student was really interested in design as a collaborative process rather than as the work of a single artistic genius. Design as a community praxis, design emerging from cooperation and collaboration. I will mention that one designer who couldn't join us via video, Dina Benrahim, actually published the research that she did in this class with alphabets. So if you visit alphabets.org, you can read her wonderful 4-part Feminist Graphic Design History in the United States series. I would encourage you to do that. And then before students share their individual stories, I wanted to share some of the things that I've been thinking about that were particularly challenging, but also useful about this project where students engaged with digital archival research, looking mostly for primary sources and looking for them sometimes in very unusual places. Most of what they found, most of what they wrote about, was in fact ephemera. It was made to be used, and then in many cases to be discarded once its use value had been used up. So just preserving and organizing a record of these materials is challenging enough in and of itself. Ephemera is notoriously tricky in libraries and archives. I'm sure on the cataloging end and certainly on the user end. So just having that record is an initial challenge. Once the record is there, the user has to navigate all of these complex systems to find what they're looking for. All systems are different. Some of them are beautifully designed and others are not. And I spent a lot of time with students individually, kind of working through how to navigate various systems. We also spent a lot of time together in class and outside of class, talking about the difference between printed and electronic sources. On the one hand, printed sources are highly convenient if you can find them, because a lot of the challenges of ephemera have been kind of dealt with for you in many but not all print sources. But electronic sources, particularly less formal ones, are further removed from centers of power, and therefore, in a lot of cases, they were much more likely to have the kinds of materials that my students were looking for to support their research. Inside of particularly informal digital sources, sometimes there are additional challenges. Absence of attribution, either because whoever compiled the collection didn't include that information, or because we simply don't know due to the nature of the materials themselves. Other challenges of contextualization. What are the materials? What's the physical experience of the objects? It's very hard to know that on a screen, but that does not render the object and the encounter meaningless. Language and money were access barriers in a lot of instances for both my students and myself. Not speaking a language or reading a language that you're using to research is particularly tricky, and some students had chosen subjects that they simply wanted to know more about. So for instance, they might want to know more about Japanese design simply because they're very curious. And we had lots of conversations about how, so long as you are very transparent about your position and what it allows you to know and not know, it's a wonderful thing to be curious about many, many aspects of the world around us. There was a student who had been adopted as a very small child and therefore didn't necessarily speak the language of their birth country. Students whose great-grandparents had immigrated and they knew a few words of their grandparents' home language, but not enough to be fluent. And then, of course, the question of if the institution that you're a part of has access to the particular archive that you want. Has your library gotten you behind whatever relevant paywall? And all of these problems are compounded by sort of what I've called here the unbearable whiteness of archives. Stories outside the center, outside the mainstream, outside the canon, are perhaps easier to find than they used to be, but that does not make them easy to locate by any stretch of the imagination. And yet my students, mostly through sheer perseverance and passion for their work, and a desire to know more about, in many cases, their own context and their own history as designers, they persevered and they discovered, uncovered read about, followed many footnotes to know more about subjects that were really important to them. So as I wrap up my introductory remarks, these are the folks we'll hear from next. We'll hear from Megan and Samira with guests Gilberto and Alejandra. All of them will introduce themselves. And then Bria and Melanie will talk to us about their cross-disciplinary collaboration as a special collections librarian and a graphic design educator, both of them at the University of Arkansas. And they have some amazing images to share with us and a wonderful story to tell about how collaborations across disciplines can really enrich practice for everyone. So thanks for joining us in this digital format, and enjoy these stories.
Hello everyone, I'm Megan McCormick. I'm a graphic designer, illustrator, letterpress printmaker, and I'm in my third year of my MFA in graphic design at Ohio University. I have an interest in digital research methodology and have worked closely with Dory Griffin to collect imagery from online archives and databases for a historical book on printing and printing technology. Due to the ease and accessibility of the internet, digital research has become an increasingly popular method of research. My primary goal was to seek out high-resolution images, source these images in order to determine their copyright status and validity, and to document my findings electronically in a shared database with Dory. Because of the relative age of the target materials we were after, a vast majority of images found are part of the public domain. This means that these images are no longer protected by intellectual property laws, including copyright, trademark, or patent laws. Essentially, they cannot be owned by one specific entity. Though we use many different types of sources, the most reliable for our needs were databases and image repositories, such as the Library of Congress's online catalogs, many public libraries' digital collections, archive.org, Flickr Creative Commons, and Wikimedia Commons. Afterwards, any necessary photo editing would be done in Photoshop or Lightroom, though this was primarily color correcting. One thing that I did not anticipate was how well this research would overlap with my experience working in a type shop. At Ohio University, I helped to manage the type shop and bindery within the School of Art plus Design, and personally created and continue to develop the organizational system in place for nearly 320 unique drawers of type and 11 different presses as we moved it into a larger space over June and July of 2019. Searching for different type specimens from scanned specimens created in the past and by present-day foundries inspired moving and sorting the equipment and type in the new space to follow the current classifications of typefaces used in America, and the need for additional information such as the designer of the typeface or the foundry associated with its creation, the original casting date of the letter forms, and the general health of the specific drawer to become necessary to be included in the typeface and equipment master list for the shop. Though this is ultimately a win for both my research with Dory and for the type shop and bindery, tracking down these different type specimens, equipment manuals, and pricing lists of printing type and typographic material made for sale created between roughly 1885 and 1950 was a bit trickier than originally anticipated as they required combing through these documents page by page. However, finding reliable information and discovering new sources for material has been incredibly beneficial to me as I continue to work towards my master's. Thank you.
Hello everyone. I started my journey by finding manuscripts from some brilliant periods of history in my country. This is an example from Shahnameh. I found this example on Reddit website, and also I had the opportunity to find many other amazing manuscripts. At that time, I wished I could be in Iran to have access to physical copies and also Iranian online resources. But when I started my research, I figured out I can find many examples and information about them online. It was really helpful for me. Later, I found this website. I had the opportunity to find many other manuscripts online on this website. I started to research about print culture in Iran, I really wanted to have this example in my research. It is a dedication letter. Based on a tradition in my country, when people allocate money or properties to organizations to help other people, they print these letters on the first pages of religious or scientific books to develop dedication culture among people. It was really challenging to find an example which is of high quality, and also it was difficult to find authors and designers' name and other information such as date, place. Finally, I found an article related to this on an Iranian website which was Nurmax. For the next step, I chose to talk about Obat Shiva's 11th Festival of Art Shiraz poster. The first time I saw this poster, it was shocking because it reminded me of Milton Glazer's Bob Dylan poster. I was curious and I wanted to understand why Obat Shiva used those forms. I was able to find different interviews from Obat Shiva and also Milton Glazer's online to find the reason. I figured out he used these forms because Milton Glaser was inspired by Iranian forms to design Bob Dylan poster. Now I am going to talk about this piece of advertisement. It is a vodka advertisement published in Tamasha magazine before Iran's revolution in Iran. After that, they stopped advertising alcoholic drinks, also having female models on advertisements without hijab. When I decided to work on this part, I found a website, Javanon 56, which has collected many of these magazines and advertisements from the time before revolution and made an online archive of them. It was amazing because even if I was in Iran, I did not have access to them easily. We have some copies of them in the National Library, but just grad students and higher levels can be a member of that library. Finding many examples on the internet and having access to digital archives inspired me to work on my concern, which is freedom. And I started to collect samples from different parts of the world. Also, I had the opportunity to learn about the ideas behind them and see their effects. These are posters about prohibitions of street harassments that I found on Harass Watch website, which is for raising people's awareness about this issue in my country. So I collected many samples and I started my research about freedom. My ultimate goal is to design an activist visual communication campaign for distribution in my country. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gilberto Corona. I'm an MFA student at the University of Florida. My experience with graphic design history digital archives is based on the Mexican graphic design history. The main objective of this project was to create an annotated bibliography identifying graphic manifestations in Mexico within the Canvas Review in the graphic design history course. In this bibliography, I included a podcast citation among other traditional resources. The podcast I reference is a roundtable named Modernity and Design in Mexico during the Design Congress Foro Historia del Diseño en México that took place in 2015 and was sponsored by the National Institute of Fine Arts. My experience finding images in podcast transcripts started when I decided to look for conversations about Mexican design history in podcast format. To my surprise, the channel listed all episodes in video formats, something I haven't seen in a podcast platform. Congress included 5 roundtables and 1 master conference, centered in design history of Mexico. In these roundtables, researchers explored the role of graphic artists, technology, advertising advances, as well as some of the institutions that lead these changes during the modernization of Mexico. The podcast channel offers 8 hours of content from 21 participants. Javier Galindo's work is a semiotic analysis of theater playbills distributed by the Palace of Fine Arts in Mexico City from 1934 to 1968. The images found in 220 printings include 2,600 adverts from plates that expose consistent sensibilities. Thanks to the work of Javier Galindo, I was able to compare two sides of the Mexican identity during that time. For instance, the audience who attended to the Fine Arts Palace was part of a high middle class, showing different aesthetics and gender stereotypes, conceptualizations, along with objects of desire that prove specific attributes for this audience. Overall, Galindo Image Collection shows aesthetics inspired by the vanguard movement, whether mass distribution mediums like newspapers aim to more low-class populations.
Hello, my name is Alejandra Silva, and in this opportunity I reflect on my process of finding digital resources for a graphic design history research project I did in fall 2019. I studied books for children coming from different periods in history, from manuscript culture to postmodernism. For my research, I used digital and physical archives. The digital ones were of great help when looking for older materials, or for materials coming from diverse cultures. My findings relate to the topics that were deemed appropriate for children, to visual communication in those books, and to the way children were constructed as an audience in different historical or geographical contexts. I did also encounter some limitations in the research process. One of them was my lack of experience working with databases, which made it hard for me to make sure I had explored in depth all the resources available in each archive. Another limitation related to the use of databases was finding pieces poorly described with metadata. Since usually the only way to access content is typing keywords, and my search was more visual than topic-oriented, I experienced a hard time finding useful materials. Being able to view catalogs instead of having to fill in a search box made me prefer certain archives over others. In this sense, the most surprising finding in terms of the research experience combined with the quality of the finding was Petiash, a book published in Moscow in 1926, which I chose as a case of a modernist graphic publication. I found this book on the website of the Playing Soviet project developed by the Princeton's Center for Digital Humanities, which focused on a series of books for children that show the political changes in Russia after 1917, as well as the new styles and techniques of the Russian avant-garde such as photomontage, experimental typography, and socialist realism. What I highlight about the archive in which I found Petiash is a series of helpful features. Its accessibility, the curated content they offer, the opportunity to view the complete catalog, the quality of the images, and the fact that they provide access to view the entire complete books instead of just fragments. In sum, I value from this research experience the opportunity to travel in time and place while building a collection of images. And as most travelers do, I particularly enjoyed those parts of the journey in which maps and signs were there to guide and ease my exploration.
Hi, my name is Bru McMahon, and I'm an assistant professor of graphic design in the School of Art at the University of Arkansas.
And I'm Melanie Griffin. I'm the assistant head of special collections in the University Libraries, also at the University of Arkansas.
I teach a class in the graphic design department called Technology in Context. This is an advanced course focused on speculative explorations in the world of interaction design. This past year, my senior students focused on three main themes: uncertainty, which included data analysis, visualization, and narrative; community, including participatory design, systems, and collaboration; and finally, futuring, which covered speculation, the built environment, and machine learning. Our second project, students put their knowledge of big data and narrative to use and researched a specific community in some way unique to Northwest Arkansas. Using the information they collected, they speculated on the future of interaction by designing conversational user interfaces or chatbots. This opened up a discussion on data bias, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. Students worked in small groups in special collections to select a data set. They then cleaned and recorded their data, ideated different visualizations, and drew conclusions. The final deliverable of the project took the form of a conversational user interface or chatbot that was inspired by information gathered during a special collections archival visit. Conversational user interfaces, or CUIs, use data to facilitate interactions with their users. So students use the data they collected to identify how it could be leveraged to improve the lives of their user group through specific interventions and interactions.
Thanks, Bree. I'm going to be discussing the visit that Bree and her students made to the archives and special collections at the University of Arkansas. So students visited the archives just as they started working on their project to build a bot. And the purpose of the visit was twofold. We wanted to introduce students to archival collections as sources of data, and we wanted to allow students to practice extracting data sets from archival sources. It's not as easy as it might sound. So to meet these objectives, we did 2 activities over one 75-minute class session in the archives. First, we looked at examples of data visualization that can be found in the archives. And then students used a pre-selected set of archival collections to practice extracting data sets. And since, like most of you, I'm assuming, I've been working from home since March and don't have access to our collections, I'm unfortunately not going to be able to show you the exact images and collections and data sets that we looked at. Hopefully, my scrounged internet images will be enough to give you an idea of the types of things we looked at and talked about. Bree, will you advance the slide? So first, we looked at a lot of math and science examples from our rare books collection and investigated the ways that mathematical principles, scientific laws, and geographic features have been visualized and how those features changed over time with the changing of technology. Next slide. We also looked at materials relating to the production of Kent Bonner's Arkansas Florilegium, which is a mashup of 2 different data sources. First, it uses botanist Edwin B. Smith's 1978 survey of the plants of Arkansas. And Bonner superimposed 3 decades worth of field notes and drawings onto this text. So students investigated the finished book, which you see on the slide here, and explored it in conjunction with Bonner's field notes and journals, which I unfortunately don't have an image of, to see how the individual pieces were put together into this particular visualization. Next slide. Another type of resource that we investigated was a digitally mediated visualization of archival collections in the Rower Reconstructed project. Rower was the Japanese internment camp located in Arkansas during World War II. And the Rower Reconstructed project takes archival sources and data from archives around the state and puts them in conversation with each other via visualizations. Next slide. For example, you can trace the activities of individuals across archives and documents through network analyses like this one, which shows the people that Nathaniel R. Griswold, a U.S. Army officer who was stationed at Rower, interacted with, and the documents that he both produced and the documents that mention him. Next slide. So following independent investigation of these visualizations, we had a group discussion during the archival visit centered on questions of archival silences. The question students were asked to discuss was, data visualizations often omit information. What information do you think is missing from your selected visualization? Whose or what story does the visualization not tell? This discussion provided students with the opportunity to start thinking about gaps in information records and how visualizations can privilege certain aspects of a data set while erasing others. The Rower Reconstructed visualization on the previous slide, for example, the visualization focuses on the network of a U.S. Army officer who worked at the camp. Next slide. After looking at example visualizations, we asked students to work with a pre-selected set of archival collections that we knew contained data sets that described a specific community in Arkansas or our smaller community in Fayetteville. So for example, students used University of Arkansas yearbooks to find data sets about previous cohorts of U of A students. Next slide. Working in groups of 3, students selected an archival collection to investigate. Most of the students in the class hadn't conducted archival research previously, so I provided them with a list of questions to guide their exploration. These questions help students pinpoint material aspects of their data set, as well as information represented in the data set, both of which would help them as they created their visualization. So first, we asked students to explore the materiality of the collection. Specifically, what kind of collection and materials are you working with? What type of information or data is represented in these materials? What community or communities are represented? And then we asked students to focus more specifically on the data sets. How will you go about extracting your data set from the archival collections that you're looking at? What challenges do you face in extracting this data? Students are working entirely with paper-based media for this part of the project. So they had to get their data set from a physical artifact to something that they could build their chatbot with. And then once they had their data set, we asked them to think what kind of story that they wanted their data visualization to tell, who their target audience would be, and what form their final data visualization would take. And after completing this exercise, students went back to the studio to continue work on the project, and I'll let Bree talk a bit more about student outcomes.
Thank you, Melanie. Using the discussions and the information that the students collected during their archival visit, students first generated a variety of data visualizations to better understand the scope of the problem facing a specific community that they were interested in. These visualizations provided them with data conclusions that would become the basis of a chatbot concept. Students collected a wide variety of data. One group used yearbook photos, as Melanie mentioned, from all across the decades. Another looked into median household income by race, Walmart's revenue over time, and overall wage growth. A few groups looked specifically into crime rates, death, and suicide, while another focused on Latino immigration rates since 1990. Two groups got quite creative, looking into various social media accounts related to the university, and another comparing teen pregnancy rates to the top song and artist by year. While students worked directly with the data found in special collections, others used what they learned from the archival visit to pull more data from online sources. Based on the data they collected, they made decisions about their chatbot concept. They defined its specific purpose, personality, and target audience. This launched an ideation and prototype phase. Students then used online programs such as ChatFuel, BotMock, or Bot Society to prototype their chatbots. They began by using principles of information architecture to design conversational flows that could be input into the software to create an actual working prototype. These prototypes were then tested by their peers, all based on their initial data collection. Here are some examples of some of the student outcomes. Winifred was the workplace equity bot, the helpful hog, your virtual assistant to all things University of Arkansas. Creepy Care was a bot that navigates you through dangerous situations. Brittany, a virtual assistant for nosy parents. Jubilee, a chatbot to help you get offline. Murdar, a chatbot dedicated to all things murder in Arkansas. And finally, Cassie, a virtual assistant for immigrants moving to the immediate area. One particular successful student outcome was FACE, a chatbot to empower people to conquer stigmas. This group of students used yearbooks from the archives to collect data that inspired their final deliverable. These images show their method of data collection. They tracked the rate of smiling amongst male and female students in 1930, 1970, and 2010. Using the data that they collected, they generated this data visualization, which is just a small portion of it. It was actually quite large, but it does not all fit on the slide. And this data viz actually used different emojis to illustrate the smiling rate. They came to a simple conclusion that men smile in photos less than women. That conclusion inspired their chatbot FACE, a virtual assistant that empowers both men and women to subvert various stereotypes. This group of students dug deep into the issues surrounding the way men and women feel pressured to present themselves. They asked hard questions like, why do women feel obligated to present themselves as friendly and approachable? Why might men avoid smiling in photographs? What are the emotional challenges men and women face in intimate relationships and at work? Their chatbot concept was a speculative design that analyzed a user's facial expressions to help them face difficult emotional situations in order to communicate more effectively with greater confidence. This group's project was successful due to their dedication to the data they found in the archive and their imagination and curiosity as they referred back to it throughout their work. Thank you so much for listening today and watching. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or Melanie.